Hello everyone, Loadabuggy here, and today I want to do something a little bit different with this commentary. I would like to talk about something that occurred in the news just last week. Now, I understand I am a little bit late to the bandwagon here talking about this event, that event being the purchase of RoosterTeeth from one of the original founders, Bernie Burns, and his production company, Box Canyon Productions. But I wanted to talk about what this means for the YouTube community, the gaming community, and just what it means as a whole, and what RoosterTeeth meant in the past. Now, when RoosterTeeth got shut down about 9 or 10 months ago, or they announced that they were getting shut down 9 or 10 months ago, it was a big punch in the stomach for many of us because a lot of us grew up with Rooster Teeth and Achievement Hunter, Let's Play, etc. And hearing that this company that was such a staple in many of our lives was shutting down was just awful. Now, sadly, the state that Rooster Teeth was in whenever it did get shut down wasn't the best. It wasn't the Rooster Teeth of old. It wasn't the Achievement Hunter of old. It kind of evolved into something that really didn't have the same appeal that it once had. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't good things that came out of that era of Rooster Teeth, but there was definitely something missing. And I noticed myself as a viewer that kind of started to change for the worst, or change just the direction of the content a little bit in a way that wasn't as interesting to me when Bernie Burns left the company in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that Bernie Burns is the whole reason that Rooster Teeth was a success back then, but he definitely had a part to play in being a successful leader and manifesting quality content, because Red vs. Blue was at its best whenever Bernie was leading the company. Ruby was established, I believe, whenever Bernie was in charge of the company. It might have been Matt Hullum at the time, but that's kind of irrelevant. But during this era when Bernie was heavily involved in the production of everything regarding Rooster Teeth, that's when Rooster Teeth was at its best. And I don't want to just point out how great the content was back then, because there's a lot of reasons for why the content could have been better than what it was in the modern version of Rooster Teeth. So I don't want to give Bernie the full credit, per se, but there was a lot of great that came out of Rooster Teeth and Achievement Hunter whenever Bernie was leading the company, and then whenever Matt Hullum was leading the company. Obviously, the real downfall of the company and what caused the actual spiral was whenever they sold the company to Warner Brothers. And whenever you get corporate entertainment involved at all, that's usually whenever you tend to see a swift decline in the quality of an entertainment product. So I think it really is important to point out that Rooster Teeth, now being owned by an independent production studio owned by one of the original founders, is a big green flag for the return of this entire company. One of the many problems of being owned by a mega corporation like Warner Brothers is that you kind of have too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will, too many hands in the pot. Plus, there's a hyper-focus on making sure that the product that you're putting out is making as much money as possible. And whenever you're a company like Rooster Teeth, who prided itself on pushing out content and pushing out shows that were full of passion and had excitement from the creators, it makes it hard to be owned by a company like Warner Brothers that has such a hyper-focus on making as much money as possible that sometimes that means that creativity can take a hit. And I think we saw that a ton with Rooster Teeth as they continued to make content after their acquisition from Warner Brothers. If we take a look at the quality of the shows that Rooster Teeth was putting out whenever they were still an independent company, they really were at their absolute best. Whether you're talking about Achievement Hunter or you're talking about Rooster Teeth as a whole, the content they were pushing out was the most memorable whenever they were an independent company. And one of the things that Rooster Teeth always prided itself on was the sense of community that they were able to create with their content. They had some voodoo black magic that just allowed them to connect with their audience in a way that I have never seen from any other internet production company before. They had the most dedicated fan base of any YouTube channel or internet site, etc., in the history of the internet, I think. And they prided themselves on building that community and maintaining that community and keeping trust with their audience. And although they did have a little bit of trouble with that, with the few controversies that they did have during their 20-plus year existence as a company, but that's not to say that they didn't also establish a ton of trust with how they handled some of those things as well. That's not to say everything was flawless by any means, and that's not to say that they didn't goof up and didn't handle things in the best way possible, but I do feel like they did a really good job in the grand scheme of things at building trust with an audience and maintaining that trust with an audience to a degree. And I think that sense of trust and that sense of community is what made Rooster Teeth what it was. Sure, the content was great. It was funny. It was meaningful. It was nostalgic for all of us. I mean, half of us grew up with Rooster Teeth, which is why we loved it so much. But they were still able to bring in new audience as well, whether they were old or young or anywhere in between. They were still able to create community for people of all ages, whether you watched them at the beginning of your life or during your teenage years, your childhood years, whatever it was. They still found a way to connect with people one way or another, and some of that came with just the amounts of content they were pushing out and the vast variety of content they were pushing out, whether you liked Let's Play style videos or you liked scripted shows like Red vs. Blue, Ruby, or Camp Camp. Being able to create that community in the first place and be able to maintain it for 20 years is what made Rooster Teeth great. I have personally never seen a community as attached to a group of creators as I have with the Rooster Teeth community. And that's one of the things that gives me a ton of hope with this purchase. I know what Rooster Teeth looked like under the leadership of Bernie Burns. I know the level of quality of content that he likes to make sure is being produced, and I've seen how important it is to him to maintain a community that is very lovingly and tactfully built over a 20-year period. So I personally have great faith that Bernie will be able to do it again. I know there were other founders of the company, but Rooster Teeth as a whole really all started because of Bernie Burns. If he didn't have the idea for Red vs. Blue, then none of that would have happened in the first place. He also has this old school internet strategy of content creation where it doesn't really cross the line of ever being controversial in the sense that it divides people, but in fact it does the opposite. Back in the old days of Rooster Teeth, they just tried to make a variety of different types of content that connected with a vast amount of different people from all walks of life and just try to make them laugh in as many ways as possible. Now I imagine that the comedy they were producing back in those days, in the year 2025, really wouldn't quite fly and would be perceived as offensive or controversial, but that wasn't the case for all types of content that Rooster Teeth was producing at that time. I imagine this is going to be an evolution for Rooster Teeth, but I also think it's going to be somewhat of a fusion of the old school comedy that they used to produce back in the day, but with a more modern approach, of course. All of this to say that I understand how important Rooster Teeth was to the internet at the time because it was just as important to me. And just like the rest of the internet, I am extremely excited that Rooster Teeth is already coming back less than a year after they were shut down. Now I know myself and others have had to be a little bit conscious of our expectations of what this new era of Rooster Teeth will look like, but at the same time, I'm extremely optimistic. It seems like in many different genres on YouTube, we're starting to see the old YouTube kind of trickle its way back into the forefront. The brain rot, high-energy YouTube has become tiresome for many people, including myself, and that's probably the reason why you're watching this video right now, is because you're not really interested in the high energy, but you like the old classic Call of Duty commentaries, and that's pretty much the exact same reason I'm excited for Rooster Teeth's return. I'm hopeful that a guy that understood what made YouTube great back in the day will be able to create something that, again, is modern, but is also able to capture what made YouTube great in the early 2010s. If executed properly, the return of Rooster Teeth could be a massive service to the internet space as a whole. It could realign people's expectations of what content could be. Not every creator has to be Mr. Beast or Kai Cenat. They can slow things down, or they can be a little bit more traditional. That's not to say that Rooster Teeth is traditional. They really never have been. They've been one of the most unique entities on the internet space since their existence. But that's also just the thing, that their uniqueness has never been really duplicated or replicated. The closest we ever got to a second Rooster Teeth, or the second coming of Rooster Teeth, was the Creatures, and unfortunately they suffered the same fate that Rooster Teeth did about 8 years prior. I think, and actually, in fact, I know that Rooster Teeth means a lot to the YouTube space and the internet as a whole, so seeing something like this return after our hearts were all crushed that it was being shut down in the first place is a massive W, and this has the potential to be the greatest relaunching of a brand in the history of YouTube. Many times brands like this have tried to return and try to recapture what made them great in the first place and kind of capture that magic and stick it in a bottle, and pretty much all of them have failed. But if there was one guy that I had even a little bit of faith in to actually successfully bring back from the dead an entity like Rooster Teeth, that man would be Bernie Burns. So here's to the return of Rooster Teeth.